He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday and Friday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content such as interviews and D&D campaigns at patreon.com/CryptidClues. Welcome to Cryptid Clues, everybody. I'm your host, Reuben Olson. Today's episode is all about story time. Stay and listen as we go over a very loose fictional reimagining of the Cowman of Copalis Beach. Check out the original story by S.D. Baker online at bigfootencounters.com. If you like us, however, head on over to CryptidClues.ca, ask us questions at our email, cryptidclues@gmail.com, and support us on Patreon if you want for $1 or more for ad-free exclusive content and more. Finally, you can find us on almost all social media. With that being said, let's dive right into a fictional retelling based on the Cowman of Copalis Beach. It was a cold winter night, mid-December, when I was awoken by the creaking bedroom door being swung wide open by my child. The soft touch of the heater at the base of my bed numbed my feet as they poked out of the blanket. Suddenly, I was shaken and tugged by my arm, which hung off the side. My child's terrified voice called out to me and told me that something he called the Cowman was at his window again. We had brushed this off before as a typical late-night imaginary monster, but now I had to go with him, kicking and screaming, to his room to put him back to sleep. As we walked down the upstairs hallway to his bedroom, which I should note resided on the second floor, I caught the whiff of something foul. Suddenly, my son went quiet. There was a faint odor, and it lasted only for a moment. My son's bedroom door was open just wide enough for him to slip out, and upon opening it further, I saw his blanket wasn't thrown off, but crumpled, as if he had carefully and slowly slid out of bed in order to be as sneaky as possible. He told me in a scared whisper that he didn't want to go back to bed in his room. He was afraid the Cowman would tap on his window again. I looked up and over to the window, covered in frost and beaten by the falling snow. "There's nothing to be afraid of," I said. "The Cowman isn't real." But that's when I saw the streaks on his window. And they weren't on the inside of the glass pane. They were definitely on the outside. And again, we were on the second floor. My son told me, "Daddy, I want to sleep with you and Mommy. I don't want to sleep in here." And while my tired brain didn't want to investigate the streaks too seriously, they were quite off-putting, so I brought him back to the bedroom, and he crawled into bed between us. The next morning, I told my wife what had happened. We went outside together in a bundle of sweaters and winter jackets. We walked down the porch steps and around the east side of the house to look below his window. It was at least 9 feet off the ground to the very base of the window, and I could not touch it if I tried really hard. There was the old doghouse below his window, however. It had belonged to our dog Nessie, who we presumed passed away last year when she went missing in the woods. We let her out for a pee break, and something made her bolt. She never came home. And it was on the roof of this doghouse I noticed that the fallen snow wasn't as thick. Something had been on top of it. The lumps of snow made it hard to see any impressions, as it had snowed on top of this another 3 inches since last night. but there were indentations that clearly showed something had stood on top of this doghouse. We followed the indentations, or these tracks as you will, to the barn around the back of the house and to the west of our property. The cows had been quiet lately and did not make noise like they used to early in the morning. The barn door was closed, and the footprints seemingly stopped in front of it. Inside, the cows were standing around in their stalls as normal. The heat lamps and hay created an unusual smell mixed with the cows, which had defecated in the stalls they rested in. Nothing was too out of place, however, but the barn door was latched, so whatever, or now whoever this was, had opened and closed the door. My wife pointed out that something in this barn made tracks out from it into the window, but only produced one trail. There were no return sets of tracks. We only followed this one way. We were getting a little freaked out, and so we went back to the house to make sure our son was safe. And he was. He was watching morning cartoons, sitting next to the Christmas tree. He had gathered himself some cereal, which he was munching on. Concerned about whoever this could have been on our property, we called the police. The nearest town was at least 11 kilometers away, and we had no neighbors near our lone farmland. We told them what happened last night and what we found this morning, and so a couple of officers came out to investigate. By the time the police arrived, the falling snow had almost completely covered the tracks, and there was only the hint of hours left in the snow and the inconsistency in the amount of snow on the ground where the tracks used to be. Still, it was a concern, and we weren't ones to make calls to the police so often, so one officer decided to head back into town and gather some supplies so that they could stay overnight. Nothing happened for another week until Christmas Eve. The snow had stopped falling after that fateful night, and so had begun to melt and clear up to the point where you could see the grass and the road to our house become clear again. I was outside tending to the animals when my son, who was playing in the snow a ways off in the yard, was standing still, frozen. I walked my way back over to him, and I bent down and asked him what was wrong. "The cowman," he said, pointing off into the woods. I looked up to the tree line and couldn't see anything. He kept pointing and telling me that it was right there. I asked him what the cowman looks like. "It's big, hairy, and stinks like the cows." We both looked for a minute more, and I noticed that it was oddly quiet. Uncomfortably, I carried him into the house and told my wife to keep an eye on him. I grabbed my rifle from the bedroom, loaded it, and went outside. I locked the front door, and then went to continue tending to the animals with the gun slung over my shoulder. After I finished, I pulled out my phone, called my cousin, Leonard. We were planning to go into town tomorrow after Christmas morning and stay at their place for Christmas Day, have dinner, all that stuff. I told Leonard what had happened a while ago with the footprints and all, and that I'd appreciate it if he was set up enough for tomorrow, if he could come over and help me look around for what I imagined was maybe a big bear. I didn't want it to sound too crazy. But I told him I didn't want this bear to get the cows. Now, Leonard helped me hunt a big one last summer, but he told me if it was a bear, it's probably hibernating, but he said he'd come check it out with me anyways. Leonard arrived just before dusk, and we got ourselves bundled up and loaded to go see if we could find anything. We walked over to the spot that my son was pointing at, and noticed that there were some big indents in the ground. Astonished that a bear must have been here, Leonard got a little excited. We tracked it out to the edge of our property, a fair ways into the woods. We went through what was quite a lot of dense vegetation, most of which had dried up for the winter. And when we got up the hill, we found a spot where it must have been resting. I noticed from here that you could just make out the barn through all the dead trees, down the hill and way off in the distance. Suddenly, Leonard shouted, "I see it!" He sprang up and fired his rifle with very little warning. After the bang and a flinch from me, I looked around in his direction like a madman. Something crashed and smashed its way through the forest away from us. "Did you get it?" I asked. "I think so," he said. "I saw the butt end and black fur. I don't know what got into me, but I just fired at it." We went over to the spot he saw and noticed a bit of spattering on the snow. He definitely wounded it. The tracks it left behind were hurried and streaked out. We followed the trail and the blood quickly stopped. The tracks went right up an incline that was impossible to get up by ourselves. "I don't think it's coming back," I said. And with that, Leonard and I made our way home. And at this point, I had convinced myself that it must have been a bear that we were dealing with this whole time, and I was happy with the result. We must have scared it off. After we got home, my cousin left to go back into town, giving us hugs and telling us we'd see him tomorrow for Christmas. We finished our dinner and went to get ready for bed. Get ready for the big day tomorrow. My son could barely contain his excitement for Christmas. I told him he'd have to fall asleep, otherwise Santa won't come. If he hears Santa on the roof tonight, he just has to close his eyes and go back to sleep. With the thought of reindeer and Santa eating cookies tonight, we tucked him in and went to bed, but not after I took a few bites of the cookies next to the fireplace. I didn't expect to hear anything on the roof that night. Again, the bedroom door opened with a creak, and then a slam. My son jumped into bed crying, too scared to talk. I was about to ask him what was wrong while my wife comforted him. But then I heard it. Something was running back and forth on the roof, making all kinds of noise. Sounded like the thumping you'd hear from a child upstairs, but twice as loud. I hopped out of bed and grabbed the rifle, went straight down the hall. I stopped to look in my son's room and noticed the window. The streaks were back, and the snow was falling quite heavily. But very clearly, something had left handprints all over his window. The impression of a mouth pressed against the window, as if something had been licking it. I went back to the bedroom and dug into the closet quickly. My wife was now crying along with our son. I loaded and handed her my father's old revolver, told her to hold on to this, protect her son if anything happens. Without putting on any winter jacket or warm gear, I rushed outside, straight away into my pajamas. I did make time to grab the flashlight from the jacket closet, but as soon as I opened the front door, the thumping stopped. The night was dark and hard to see. I turned on the light, and I was stunned by what I not only could smell, but saw. There was blood everywhere, all over our porch, all over our yard. Something tore apart a deer and hurled pieces of it all over. The railing in particular, I noticed the leg hanging off the side, its meat entrails glistening in the light and cold. The snow falling and melting right on the surface. It was still warm. I wanted to gag so bad. I went back in, slammed the front door shut, and pulled out my cell phone to call 911. No service. We usually got a bar or two out here, but the weather and snow must have been affecting it. I reached and moved around to find a bar, sweating desperately. Could feel my breathing and my arms shaking. That's when I heard it, the sound of glass shattering. My wife screaming, and then a gunshot. And I realized the glass shattered first. It broke in. I ran upstairs and honestly can't remember much in between the time I heard the gunfire and when I entered the bedroom. I vividly recall the curtain blowing in the bedroom, cold air and snow pouring in, glass all over the floor. My wife gripping my son so tightly, pressed against the furthest wall away from the window, her arm extended, shaking, still pointing the gun outside. I heard her sobbing, my child crying, and in between that, I heard something else, groaning deeply in just as much pain and fear. I ran to the window and saw a big shadow limping toward the barn. making ungodly sounds that, to this day, send a chill down my spine when I think about it. I knew I had to stop this thing from coming back. So I did the only thing I could. I told my wife to keep trying to call 911, and I was going outside to go after it. By the time I got to the barn, I unlatched it and saw that the cows were still there in their stalls, again, oddly quiet, stiff, unmoving, and I could smell it. Something in here reeked. I shone my flashlight everywhere. I couldn't make out where it could be. I checked behind each hay bale, pointing my light and rifle in every which direction. Nothing. But then I heard it shuffle from upstairs, up in the ladder in the hayloft. I walked up to the ladder and stared up the dark hole to the loft. I gulped. Just as I was about to work up the guts to go up, a dark shadow tore by the open barn door. I went out and saw it running into the woods. It wasn't limping anymore. Strange. I fired as many rounds as I could, one after another, but I don't think any of them were successful. Red and blue light shone behind me, and finally we had help. I suppose my wife told them about us firing our guns, because a lot of officers came, and they came quite fast. They stayed for hours into the night, investigating and questioning everything. But what really got me with their investigation was the hayloft. They sent what seemed like everybody up there, and then later asked me if I had hit anything with my gun. They found blood in the loft. But when I told them that it had dropped down and ran into the woods, they told me that the external loft gate was locked tight from the inside. It couldn't have come down any other way but the ladder that it took up. That never sat right with me. That means this whole time there wasn't just one of these things running around. After their investigations and more questioning, especially regarding the scattered deer carcass, they took some samples of the blood in the loft. They followed the tracks into the woods and told me that just before it hit the tree line, the footprints disappeared into thin air. Soon, the officers themselves had more questions than answers to the whole scenario. They decided there was more than enough evidence that somebody was on our property, and so, again, they left an officer with us until the sun rose for Christmas morning. We decided against spending the morning at our place and went straight to my cousin's. We were tired and barely made it through. But we managed to do it all and slept in his place for the next couple days. Nobody wanted to go back home. So we decided I would drive back home with Leonard and quickly grab our clothes and some of the things that we missed so we could stay a few more nights in town. Well, when we arrived back on our property, my heart sunk into my stomach. The deer carcass was still mostly there, rotting, but the front door was open, wide open. We went inside and saw that the living room was turned upside down. The Christmas tree was thrown over, decorations broken all over the floor. The furniture was destroyed. Leonard told me that he had still thought it could have been a bear up until this point. He was convinced I was crazy and making up half the stories that we were telling him. But when he saw the damage, he started to change his mind. Because the food in the kitchen was still there. The fridge was torn out from the wall and opened, but not a single speck of food was eaten. So if it was a bear, it would have eaten something, right? Perhaps the scariest part of this was that when we went upstairs, despite every nook and cranny of the house being trashed, and even our bed broken down the middle, the strangest thing was that our son's room was unscathed. His door was the only one not open, and everything inside was perfect. Even his bed, which we had left unmade, was now tucked in nicely and put back together. We never did return to that house, and we sold the property first chance we got. To this day, I've never worked up the courage to go back and see what remains of it. The police questioned us up until the day that they said they would get the blood sample back. After that date, though, they never reached out to us again, and when I call in for answers, I only get vague ones. The end. Thanks for listening to this episode of Cryptid Clues, everybody. If you liked it, give us a like and check out our links for more. For now, have a good night and bye-bye.